In their 1967 song Within You, Without You, the Beatles, or specifically George Harrison, sings a striking final verse. When you've seen beyond yourself, then you may find peace of mind waiting there. And the time will come when you see we're all one, and life flows on within you and without you. And this is on a song that also features heavy Indian instrumentation, rhythms, and melodies, and therefore is a very clear indication of George Harrison's increased involvement with Indian music, culture, and spirituality, a relationship that would shape him for the rest of his life, but also to a major degree, all of pop culture. George Harrison and his life has been covered to death in various places. There are a million Beatles documentaries, but what can we say about the wider movements and traditions that he engaged with throughout his life and career, and how did these traditions and both religious and musical, how did these traditions shape his life and music? Before we start the video, I want to do some self-promotion here. On this Friday, on July 19th, I'll be releasing a new song with my project Zini called Gralstänk. It's a song in Swedish based on a poem by Gustaf Fröding, a very famous Swedish poet, and I'm very happy with this song. So if you guys are interested in my music, then check out the pre-saved link in the description, or most of you will probably be watching this when the song's already come out, so there will be links to that song in the description. Check it out, share it if you like it, let me know what you think, and that's it. George Harrison is of course most famous as the lead guitarist of the band The Beatles, probably the most famous in all of history. In the later stages of their career, he would also increasingly start writing songs himself and contributed some of the band's greatest hits like Something, Here Comes the Sun, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. He was born in 1943 and grew up in Liverpool. Eventually, as we know, he joined Paul McCartney and John Lennon in what was to become the Beatles in the early 1960s. And throughout their early success and the so-called Beatlemania, he became seen as the shy Beatle. He was indeed the youngest in the group and always seems to have been quite a contemplative guy, which might be where this apparent quietness comes from. Having such massive success and becoming huge global stars at such an early age must be a pretty overwhelming experience. But it seems like George, even though he seems to have been very interested in partying and stuff like that sometimes, there seems to have been a part of him that never was really that much interested in those aspects of the rock star life. A kind of disinterest in many of the vices, riches, and pleasures of this very hectic life that he was living. And indeed, his son, Danny Harrison, would later tell of a letter that George had sent to his mother during the relatively early days of his career, where he wrote that, quote, "I'm not interested in material things, this world, fame. I'm going for the real goal." And then he adds even more significantly, "I want to be self-realized. I want to find God." And that he would find, but perhaps in some unexpected places, and indeed on a completely different continent. As is the case for many people, Harrison's way into spirituality and religion began through music. It was in 1965 when the band was filming their movie Help, and during a scene where an Indian band was playing in the background, that George became very intrigued by the sitar, a large string instrument prominent especially in North Indian Hindustani music. He tried the instrument and immediately fell in love, and this was the start of a long and deep dive into Indian culture. Harrison bought a sitar of his own in London and started practicing. And not long after, when the band was recording for the Rubber Soul album, they decided to include the instrument on John Lennon's song Norwegian Wood, a beautiful song that is certainly enhanced by the surprising soundscape created by the sitar. The fact that one can hear pretty clearly that Harrison is still very much a novice on the instrument doesn't really matter. And it certainly didn't matter to the wider Western audience who had never really encountered the sitar, at least not on a pop recording. The way that the sitar was used in Norwegian Wood, but also on the Revolver album, on tracks like Love You Too and Tomorrow Never Knows, it had an incredible impact on the world of music and pop culture. And a lot of people became inspired by this exotic sounding instrument and this use of Eastern influences, which became kind of a trope in the late 60s and 70s. But as we've explored in earlier videos about the topic, music is often directly connected in various ways with other aspects of culture, including religion and quote-unquote spirituality. And this is certainly true of India. The Indian music tradition is always in conversation with spiritual and philosophical currents in the subcontinent, and the further you dive into one, the more you will become immersed in the other. It's kind of inevitable in that way. In the wider Hindu tradition, sound itself is seen as divine. The absolute reality, called the Brahman, is identified with the syllable Om, very famous, right? This is the primordial sound or vibration that creates and lies at the core of reality. And in this form as sound, it is often known as the Nada Brahman. And Indian music and the raga system, for instance, is intimately connected with these philosophical ideas, to the point where music often becomes a direct expression or acting out of devotion, religious devotion. And as George Harrison became more interested in the sitar and wanted to deepen his knowledge and skill of the instrument, he decided to invite Ravi Shankar, one of the world's leading sitar players who was touring the country at that time, to his home to teach him. And later he also decided to travel to India twice in 1966. And here he acquired a new, better sitar from a professional luthier, but also very significantly spent weeks properly studying the instrument and Indian music generally with Shankar. And as many of you know, the two would also develop a friendship that would last for the rest of Harrison's life. If you've watched my earlier episode on John Coltrane and his spiritual journey and how that influences music, you will know that he was also deeply influenced by Ravi Shankar and was also a good friend of his. So the influence of Ravi Shankar on 20th and 21st century music cannot really be overstated. He is an incredibly important figure, and even though he's obviously very famous and beloved, I don't think people recognize just how much he influenced pop culture during the last century. In any case, and to confirm my earlier point, as he was studying music those weeks and months in India, he also started exploring some of these spiritual and intellectual currents that it is bound to. In particular, it seems that Harrison had started reading the autobiography of a yogi by Yogananda and Raja Yoga by Swami Vivekananda. Now, these are some of the most influential and significant books for the entrance of Indic thought and practice into the West, and seems to have had a major impact on Harrison, as the thoughts and ideas that he expresses even much later on in his life carry ideas that are particularly characteristic of these thinkers. Swami Vivekananda was originally from the Bengal region of India and became a devoted follower of Sri Ramakrishna, another really famous figure that we really don't have time to go into properly here, but keep an eye out on my other channel, Let's Talk Religion, because I will most likely be covering him at some point over there. But regardless, Vivekananda would become Ramakrishna's most famous and successful follower, even if he would go on to have a much more, let's call it, philosophical outlook than his master. His master was a lot more about devotion to God, particularly Kali, whereas Vivekananda, at least when he came to the West and wanted to introduce the tradition of Hinduism generally and Vedanta into the West, he took a much more philosophical approach. After he appeared very famously at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893 and gave a very celebrated speech, he became very famous in the US and the West generally, and went on to give many lectures and established Vedanta centers that are still popular and active and influential to this day. And that word Vedanta is very important, because Vivekananda very much represented a school of thought within the wider Hindu framework that is known as Advaita Vedanta, which means non-dual Vedanta. This school holds that the absolute reality, the Brahman, sometimes equated with God, is all that there is, and that all multiplicity is a kind of illusion or misunderstanding, whereas reality truly is a radical oneness or a monism. In fact, Vivekananda is largely responsible for this particular understanding of Hindu thought being so prominent in the West. A lot of people in the West here associate Hinduism particularly with some kind of pantheism or monism, that God is present in everything, right? This, not exclusively, but this is very much the influence of Advaita Vedanta in particular, which has been a very prominent school in India historically, but maybe not as prominent as its popularity here in the West will have you believe. But the kind of Vedanta or Hinduism that Vivekananda taught was also a little different from its traditional forms. For this reason, many have dubbed this a Neo-Vedanta. Vivekananda emphasized universalism, that Hinduism, with all its schools and philosophies, was essentially unified and harmonized despite many apparent differences, and even that all other religions also shared in this wider universal truth. Now, this Neo-Vedantic understanding, which still had non-dualism as its core characteristic, became very popular in the West and has shaped many people's understanding of just Indian religion in general. He also later composed the book Raja Yoga, which became a bestseller, where he talks about the philosophy of yoga through this particularly Advaitic, Neo-Vedantic perspective. Now, this is not to be confused with the more physical yoga of stretching and things like this that is so popular in the West today. In fact, Vivekananda was quite critical of that kind of physical yoga, often known as Hatha Yoga, in this particular text. So it's a more traditional understanding of yoga through the perspective of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, this old classic book, rather than the more modern physical yoga as a kind of physical exercise. Similarly, Paramahansa Yogananda is also one of the most influential spiritual figures of the 20th century. He taught a similarly universalist message, established the Self-Realization Fellowship, the SRF, and wrote the very popular book Autobiography of a Yogi, which was read by people all across the world, including, indeed, George Harrison. We can conclude thus that George Harrison was certainly exposed to the ideas and perspectives of thinkers like these two in particular. And in Harrison's music, we start seeing these themes appearing more and more from this time onward. He started meditating very regularly, and even in the song Within You Without You, we can see some very clear nods to the practice of meditation, for example. When you've seen beyond yourself, then you may find peace of mind is waiting there. This seems to be a reference to the practice of meditation, as well as the process towards samadhi or liberation that is expressed in many Hindu traditions, including in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, where we are told to practice turning away from the fluctuations of the mind and our illusory self and turn to the true self or Purusha that is pure awareness. And the last line of that song, Within You Without You, is also very interesting. We quoted it before. And the time will come when you see we're all one, and life flows on within you and without you. The idea that all things are one is not exactly a novel idea, but can be found in many traditions across the world. But in this context, I can't help but sense a particular expression of the Indic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta that we mentioned earlier. Now, Vedanta in general is a school of thought within Hinduism that is particularly devoted to exegesis and interpretation of the Vedic Upanishads and their themes like the Brahman, which is the absolute reality, as well as the Atman, or the self. Advaita, which again means not two, is the non-dual and monistic interpretation or understanding of Vedanta, most famously represented by the probably 8th century figure Shankara. Not to be confused with Ravi Shankar, who was the teacher of George Harrison, but rather Shankara, sometimes Adi Shankara or Shankaracharya also. According to Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is all there is. The Atman, or individual self, is identical to Brahman, as are all things. The multiplicity we experience in the world is an illusion called Maya, brought on by ignorance or avidya and misunderstanding of the nature of reality. All is one, in other words, as Harrison very clearly sings in the song. And this makes extra sense, of course, because, as we said, George Harrison was directly exposed to the writings and ideas of Swami Vivekananda, who was a primary representative of Advaita Vedanta in the West in particular. And we might even be able to see this in the very opening lines to the song, which seem to point to this idea of the illusory nature of the world as we commonly experience it. We were talking about the space between us all, and the people who hide themselves behind a wall of illusion never glimpse the truth, then it's far too late when they pass away. While Within You Without You from the Sgt. Pepper album is perhaps one of the clearest expressions of this developing spiritual outlook, we can sense it in other Beatles songs as well. Even when it isn't outright talking about spirituality as such, even songs like the very strange Piggies off the White Album reads as a critique against materialism and greed, which could be seen as an extension of his philosophical outlook. But it's really in the 1970s, after the Beatles had split up and Harrison had started his very successful solo career, that his devotion to Indic religion could be expressed most freely. The early solo albums of Harrison's, like All Things Must Pass and Living in the Material World, are deeply, spiritual or religiously colored in different ways, particularly these traditions that he was studying. But when we listen to these later songs, we can also sense a kind of change in his perspective, whereas the earlier songs like Within You Without You were a lot more philosophical and sort of abstract in their expression of philosophical spiritual ideas. His solo songs are quite a lot more devotional in nature. So what's going on here? Well, this story seems to have started when the Beatles made their very famous trip to India in 1968, where they spent time in Rishikesh in the ashram of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, very famous for teaching the technique of transcendental meditation. This was another very important moment in the history of Indian thought and its acceptance and entrance into Western culture, where all of the Beatles seem to have taken an interest in the spiritual wisdoms on offer here. But when they returned home from the trip, Harrison seems to have encountered another movement of Hindu spirituality that was growing in popularity at that time, namely the devotees of Srila Prabhupada, a very significant Indian teacher in the West and the founder of ISKCON, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, more widely known as the Hare Krishna movement. Harrison became very intrigued and seems to have joined or become associated with this movement. He even donated what was to become Bhaktivedanta Manor to the movement in 1973, which to this day remains the center of the Hare Krishnas in the UK. Now, the Hare Krishna movement, or ISKCON, is part of a devotional tradition of Hinduism that is quite different in some ways from the previously mentioned Advaita Vedanta. It's a school referred to as Gaudiya Vaishnavism. What does this mean? Well, when we talk about Hinduism, we are really referring to a very wide collection of religious traditions in India. And one of the most prominent of these is what is known as Vaishnavism. Now, this term in itself is very varied, but in general it denotes those who worship Vishnu as the supreme god, as opposed to worshipping Shiva, for example, the devotees of whom are known as Shaivites, or the tradition of Shaivism. Now again, there are different types of Vaishnavism, but Gaudiya Vaishnavism is quite unique. It appeared in the Gauda region of the Bengal, hence the name, and was founded by the 16th century figure Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He was a great mystic and saint and is seen by his followers as an actual avatara or incarnation of Krishna himself. The school of Chaitanya, which became known as Gaudiya Vaishnavism, puts a very heavy emphasis on something known as Bhakti, or devotion, or devotional love to God, particularly in the form of Krishna. Indeed, unlike many other forms of Vaishnavism, where Krishna is often seen as an avatar of the god Vishnu, who is the higher form of God, so to say, here in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Krishna himself is seen as the supreme form of God. And this idea of bhakti is very important. We talked earlier about Advaita Vedanta. This was a school of thought that put a very heavy emphasis on what's known as jnana or jnana, which means knowledge. Knowledge of our true self, our true reality, is what leads to liberation. And so things like rituals and devotion, bhakti for example, was kind of secondary at best and maybe even redundant and unimportant according to some. But after this, there appeared many other schools of Vedanta that challenged this idea and instead wanted to put a stronger emphasis precisely on the concept of bhakti, and thereby also a certain difference between the individual soul and God. If they put a heavy emphasis on devotion to God, that sort of requires a certain difference between us and God in order for that worship to be legitimate, right? Whereas in Advaita, everything is God. So some would argue, what's the point of worshipping when you are God yourself, so to say? So to Advaita, Brahman and the soul are identical, whereas for other later Vaishnavite thinkers, there was usually conceived to be a certain difference. We have covered this topic pretty widely on my other channel, Let's Talk Religion, so if you're interested in diving deeper into these different schools and this topic, then go check out that channel. Now, in the 15th and 16th century, Chaitanya shows up as another figure that very heavily leans towards bhakti and devotion. True liberation and freedom is not reached through gaining knowledge of our true self as identical with Brahman, but through devotional worship and love for God in the form of Krishna. Indeed, bhakti itself is the goal of human life. So it's not even necessarily true that liberation or moksha is the goal, but bhakti itself is the very goal of life. This is the radical idea of the Gaudiya Vaishnavites. So again, a strong focus on God as an external person in the form of Krishna who one devotes worship towards. And one of the main ways that Chaitanya and the Gaudiya Vaishnavites performed this bhakti in order to purify the soul was through chanting and singing the names of God. And the most central and famous of these songs or chants is, of course, the so-called Hare Krishna chant. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. It is through chanting these names that one becomes purified and comes closer to God or Krishna. And this tradition was carried forward for hundreds of years until it was established in the West primarily by the aforementioned Srila Prabhupada, after which the Hare Krishna mantra has become famous all around the world. So this is the larger devotional tradition that George Harrison seems to have attached himself to, at least by the late 60s and early 70s, and we can see very clear indications of this change, so to say, in his early solo albums. The 1970 album All Things Must Pass is without doubt his most famous and celebrated, and it's really a masterwork of pop music. But underneath the layers of catchy melodies, Harrison sings about his religious convictions. In the song Awaiting for You All, the chorus proclaims, a clear reference to the chanting practices of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. The title track, All Things Must Pass, probably one of his most beautiful compositions, is a meditation on the transitory nature of the world, a very common theme in all kinds of traditions around the world, but also in the Indic religious traditions. And the last song on the album, Hear Me Lord, is a heartfelt conversation with the divine. Even in the song Beware of Darkness, Harrison asks the listener to beware of Maya, referring to the idea of illusion so common in philosophies like Advaita Vedanta. But I think it's on his next solo album, 1973's Living in the Material World, that these themes are most clearly expressed. To me, this can basically be considered an album of bhakti devotional music in rock and pop arrangement. The light that has lighted the world speaks of people's preoccupation with worldly things and their failing to see the light of God hiding behind it all. The title track explores our current state of being born in a body in the material world and longing to escape to liberation and to be with God. The Lord loves the one that loves the Lord is pretty self-explanatory. And Be Here Now is named after the famous book by Ram Dass, one of the most famous figures and representatives of Indian spirituality in the 20th and 21st century. In short, Harrison's music is packed with references to his spiritual and philosophical beliefs. And we might even be able to see Harrison's whole musical output as a kind of devotional act in itself. It's quite common in Indian music, for example, to see the very act of performing music and writing music as a kind of form of devotion, a form of bhakti. And I feel like George Harrison, in some ways, at least with some of his music, would have probably seen it in the same way, where music becomes a spiritual practice in itself. He was clearly dedicated to and attached to Hinduism specifically throughout his life, particularly perhaps to the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, at least later in his life, it seems, from his association with the Hare Krishna movement. But his idea about religion and spirituality was also a lot more universalist in nature, just like it was for John Coltrane, for example. There is a certain perennialism and universalism that we find in his ideas. To him, God can be found in all kinds of traditions, even in the Christianity that he had disavowed. In 1972, he wrote, "All religions are branches of one big tree. It doesn't matter what you call him, just as long as you call. The Lord is in everything that's in creation. So when you look at a tree, it's really a reflection of God. You see it in other people, that's him too." This idea that there is a universal truth that is hiding in all the different religious traditions was a quite common one at that time, still a quite popular one, and was also particularly associated with and made popular by figures like Yogananda and Vivekananda. In his famous speech at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, Vivekananda said, "I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. I will quote to you, brethren, a few lines from a hymn which I remember to have repeated from my earliest boyhood, which is every day repeated by millions of human beings. As the different streams having their sources in different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they may appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee." And this kind of perennialism can also be found in some of Harrison's work. For example, still during the Beatles years, he wrote and recorded the song The Inner Light, which appeared alongside Lady Madonna as a single in 1968. This very quote-unquote spiritually oriented song is a direct adaptation of an ancient scripture. But it's not one of the great works of Hinduism, but rather the 47th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, one of the foundational texts of Taoism, which reads, at least in Harrison's version, "Without going out of my door, I can know all things of earth. Without looking out of my window, I could know the ways of heaven. The farther one travels, the less one knows, the less one really knows. Arrive without traveling, see all without looking, do all without doing." A beautiful section from the Tao Te Ching and beautifully put to music by Harrison. But this universalism can also arguably be pretty clearly found in what is his by far most successful solo song, My Sweet Lord. This is another very religious song that sings of longing for God.
I really wanna see you, really wanna be with you, really wanna see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord.
But it then goes into a section where the phrase hallelujah is repeated in unison, a common phrase of calling upon God in the Christian tradition. But then the words of this chant suddenly change from hallelujah to Hare Krishna, and the choir is suddenly doing the Hare Krishna chant as the song fades out. This was entirely on purpose and carries a kind of message of unity between the religious traditions. Despite calling the Lord by many different names, it's all the same Lord ultimately. Harrison once said of the song, quote, "I wanted to show that hallelujah and Hare Krishna are quite the same thing. I did the voices singing Hallelujah first and then the change to Hare Krishna so that people would be chanting the Maha Mantra before they knew what was going on. I had been chanting Hare Krishna for a long time, and this song was a simple idea of how to do a Western pop equivalent to a mantra which repeats over and over again holy names." And he was probably quite successful in introducing this chant to the wider public because My Sweet Lord is one of the biggest pop songs of the 1970s and again, probably his most successful solo record. There's plenty we could talk about when it comes to George Harrison and his spirituality and music, but like I said, the Beatles and Harrison himself has been covered so many different times before. But I hope this video at least provided some insight into the different traditions that he represented in different ways, the different spiritual and religious and musical traditions that he explored and which became expressed through his music, such as Advaita Vedanta, the ideas of Vivekananda and people like him, as well as the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition that were so important to George Harrison and his development in his spirituality and, as we saw, also his music. So perhaps now, hopefully, you can listen to Harrison's very beautiful songs with even more appreciation of what he is trying to do and the influences that the songs carry in that way. He really had an incredible integrity, and in many different ways, without probably even without trying to, he influenced so many aspects of how music and pop culture was to develop for the rest of the 20th century and forward. Speaking of music and using music as a kind of spiritual practice, perhaps, I am once again releasing a new song with my project Zini. This song is actually in Swedish. It's an adaptation of a poem by a Swedish poet, a mystical poem, you could say, called Gralstänk, and the poet is Gustav Fröding. Those Swedes out there will know who I'm talking about. I was influenced by this poem, this suite of poems, and sort of composed the lyrics to the song inspired by that. And that song is called Gralstänk, just like that poem. And it's coming out on Friday, July 19th. So if this goes well with the editing, that should be coming out this coming Friday. So stay tuned for that. There will be links to pre-saves, and if the song's already out, then there will be links to that song in the description, so you can check that out. It's influenced by Swedish folk music, but also in a kind of rock pop arrangement. I'm very happy with it. I hope you guys will like it as well. For now, thank you all for watching this video. I hope you will check out the song, and I will see you in the next video.